The heat of the Arizona sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the dusty, exhausted town of Willow Springs. It shimmered in waves off the hard-packed earth, warping the horizon into a watery mirage, and bleaching the paint from the buildings until they looked like the sun-bleached bones of some great forgotten beast. Thorn Mason felt the heat in his bones, a dry, aching weariness that had little to do with the weather. He stood beside his wagon, one hand resting on the flank of the small, terrified calf, penned within the other, clutching the $3 silver that felt both too heavy and entirely insufficient. Selling the calf was a betrayal. He knew it with the certainty of a prayer. It was the last direct link to Catherine's dreams, born of the prized Hereford she had insisted they buy a foolish expense at the time. But her eyes had shone with such hope. "This is our future, Thorn," she'd said, her voice full of a faith he'd lost long ago. Now that future was worth $3, barely enough to buy flour, coffee, and ammunition to last the month. "Fair price, Mason Jed Porter," the general store owner grunted, wiping a sheen of sweat from his bald head. "Market's down." Thorn just knotted his throat too tight for words. He could feel the calf trembling against his hand, its wide, dark eyes filled with a primal fear he understood all too well. He was about to turn away to retreat back to the isolation of his failing ranch when the world shattered. A gunshot cracked through the oppressive afternoon, quiet, sharp, and violent. It was followed by a woman's scream from the direction of the bank. Two men faces, obscured by dirty bandanas, burst out of the double doors, canvas sacks clutched in their hands. "Get back, everybody, get back," one of them yelled, waving a pistol wildly. Before the townsfolk could fully process the chaos, Sheriff Daniel Blackwood emerged from his office, a shotgun held loosely in one hand. Two deputies fanned out behind him, their faces a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Blackwood, however, looked entirely calm, almost serene. The scar that bisected his left cheek, a pale, jagged line from temple to jaw, seemed to pull his mouth into a permanent, cruel sneer. "Drop the bags, boys." Blackwood called his voice deceptively casual. "This day doesn't have to end in blood." The robbers hesitated, caught between the open street and the imposing figure of the law. One of them, younger and thinner, made a move, as if to comply. The other, broader and more desperate, raised his pistol. It was a mistake. Blackwood's reaction was not just swift. It was unnervingly brutal. He didn't fire a warning shot. He didn't aim to wound. The shotgun roared a deafening blast of fire and lead that tore through the broader man's chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back against the bank's facade. He slid down the wall, leaving a horrific smear of red on the weathered wood. The second robber dropped his bag and pistol in shock, his hands flying into the air. "Don't shoot, I give up." The plea was ignored. One of Blackwood's deputies, taking his cue from the sheriff, fired his rifle. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the bank's stone steps and striking a man who had been emerging from the mercantile, a father with a small parcel clutched in his hand. The man crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his simple cotton shirt. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered, diving for cover. In the midst of the pandemonium, Thorn's eyes were fixed on the dead robber. As the man's body had slumped to the ground, something small and silver had tumbled from his pocket, catching the harsh sunlight. It was a locket intricately carved with an eagle in flight. Thorn's breath hitched. The air grew thin, the sounds of the street fading into a dull roar in his ears. He knew that locket. He had held it in his own hands 15 years ago, pressing it into the palm of a dying young private, a boy named Miller from Ohio. The memory struck him like a physical blow, a whirlwind of smoke blood and the high, thin screams of the dying. The scent of pine and gunpowder, the sun filtering through the narrow walls of Apache Pass, painting the scene in sickeningly beautiful shafts of light. Lieutenant Blackwood stood over him, his face a mask of cold fury, a bloody knife in his hand. You chose them over your own men, Monroe, he'd hissed. Traitor. The locket lay in the dust beside Private Miller's still hand and the eagle's silver wings glinting in the carnage. Thorne took an instinctive step forward, his hand reaching for the impossible object lying in the Willow Springs dust. He had to see it, had to confirm the madness his mind was screaming at him. Hold it right there, Mason. Blackwood's voice was a low growl cutting through Thorne's daze. The sheriff stood between him and the locket, his shotgun now resting in the crook of his arm. His eyes cold and dark as a winter river locked onto Thorne's. It wasn't the general suspicion of a lawman securing a crime scene. It was a look of deep, chilling recognition. A look that said, I know who you are. I remember everything. Thorne froze the name he hadn't used in 15 years. Thomas Monroe, a silent scream in his mind. The past he had buried under a decade and a half of grief, hardship, and isolation had just risen from its grave in the middle of a dusty street. Blackwood's gaze held him pinned, a predator who had finally cornered his long-hunted prey. The mystery wasn't just in the locket anymore. It was in the sheriff's eyes, a promise of a reckoning that had been a long time coming. The silence that fell over the farm that night was a heavy blanket smothering the small sounds of life that usually brought Thorne a measure of peace. Tonight, the chirp of crickets felt like a lament, and the sigh of the wind through the struggling cornstalks, a ghostly whisper of names he had tried to forget. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the cabin's single lamp, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of coffee and wood smoke mingled with the metallic tang of blood. From the gash above his brow, a fresh wound laid over old, invisible scars. Luke, his 14-year-old son, sat across from him, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, angry movements. The boy hadn't said more than 2 words since they'd returned from town. His silence was a judgment, a wall built of questions he didn't know how to ask, and answers Thorne didn't know how to give. At 14, Luke already had the weight of a man twice his age in his shoulders. He was all sharp angles and simmering resentment, a boy forced to grow up too fast in the shadow of his father's secrets. In the corner, 9-year-old Grace was curled on a small rug, a piece of charcoal clutched in her small fingers. She sketched on a piece of scrap wood, her face a mask of concentration. Since her mother's death in childbirth, Grace had retreated into a world of images, her voice a rare and precious commodity. Her drawings were her language, a silent testament to the world, as seen through eyes too old for her years. She drew her mother constantly, a woman she'd never known, piecing her together from Thorne's halting descriptions and her own desperate imagination. The memory of the locket burned behind Thorne's eyes. An eagle in flight. Private Miller's last request. Give this to my ma, Captain. Tell her I was brave. A promise Thorne had failed to keep, another ghost to add to the legion that haunted his sleep. How had it ended up here in the pocket of a dead bank robber 15 years and 1,000 miles from Apache Pass and Blackwood? The look in his eyes had been more than just a memory of a long-ago conflict. It was possessive, hungry, as if the locket wasn't just a piece of the past, but a key to something he still desperately wanted. Why'd you just stand there? Luke's voice was rough, accusatory. He didn't look up from his rifle. That man was dying. The bystander. You didn't do anything. Thorne's jaw clenched. There was nothing to be done, Luke. The shot was fatal. You could have tried, Luke pressed, finally looking up. His eyes, so like Catherine's, were filled with a confusing mix of anger and disappointment. Sheriff Blackwood just gunned that man down. He shot an innocent man, and you just watched. Getting involved would have made it worse. Thorne said, his voice flatter than he intended. Blackwood is the law in this town. You don't cross him. So we just let him do whatever he wants, kill whoever he wants. Luke scoffed, a bitter grating sound. Is that what you're going to teach us, to be cowards? The word struck Thorn like a slap. Coward. Traitor. The same words Blackwood had spat at him as he lay bleeding in the dust of Apache Pass. He pushed himself away from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Go to bed, Luke. We don't need looking after Luke, shot back, his voice cracking with the strain of adolescence and a lifetime of pent-up frustration. We've been looking after ourselves for years while you just fade away. Thorn turned the lamplight, catching the raw wound on his forehead. I said go to bed. His tone was quiet, but it held a dangerous edge that stopped Luke's next words in his throat. The boy stared at his father for a long moment, his chest heaving before he slammed the rifle down on the table, turned and scrambled up the ladder to the small sleeping loft without another word. Thorn let out a long, shuddering breath, his hand twitching near the empty space on his hip where a gun had once hung. He felt Grace's small hand slip into his. He looked down into her solemn face. She held up her piece of wood. On it she had drawn a man tall and broad-shouldered, standing alone against a backdrop of dark, swirling shadows. It's okay, Papa, she whispered the words, a soft breeze in the suffocating silence. Thorn knelt, pulling her into a fierce hug. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of sunshine and dust, a small, solid anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. He had come to this harsh, unforgiving land to escape his past, to build a quiet life from the ashes of the man he used to be. But the past had found him. It had a name, Daniel Blackwood, and it had a face, a silver locket with an eagle in flight. And Thorn knew with a certainty that chilled him to his soul that running was no longer an option. The next morning, Thorn rode into Willow Springs with a grim sense of purpose. He told Luke he was buying supplies, a lie that sat like stone in his gut. His real purpose was to watch, to listen, to try and understand the new terrain of the war that had just been declared in the space of a single cold glance. He needed to gauge Blackwood's power to see how the town responded to the casual violence of the day before. As he neared the center of town, a coarse knot of men gathered in the square drew his attention. The mood was ugly, a mix of cruel laughter and jeering shouts. On a hastily erected platform stood 3 Native American women, their wrists bound with rope. They were Apache. Thorn's blood ran cold. He dismounted, moving to the edge of the crowd. An auctioneer, a greasy, rat-faced man, was trying to drum up interest. "What am I bid for these 3 prime savages?" he called out. "Guaranteed to work from sunup to sundown without a word of complaint. Let's start the bidding at $6. The crowd roared with laughter. $6. The price of 3 human lives. Less than the cost of a decent horse. Thorn studied the women. The first, tall and powerfully built, stared at the crowd with eyes that burned with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her name, he would learn, was Wee Wee. The second, Helena, seemed lost in a world of her own, her face a mask of sorrow so profound it seemed carved from stone. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon, as if searching for a life that had been stolen from her. The third woman was different. She met the gaze of the leering men, head on, her expression a careful mix of contempt and calculation. She was watching, assessing, missing nothing. And when she spoke, her voice cut through the din like a blade. "One day you will all pay for this," she said. Her English was perfect, precise, and laced with an unshakable certainty that stunned the crowd into a momentary silence. Something in her voice, a familiar cadence, a ghost of a memory plucked at a chord deep within Thorn. The auctioneer, recovering first, backhanded her across the face. "Shut your mouth, savage," he snarled. Thorn felt a muscle in his jaw leap. He saw the flicker of pain in the woman's eyes, but her chin remained high, her defiance unbroken. $6, the auctioneer repeated. Who'll give me 6? Before he had fully registered the decision, Thorn heard his own voice rough and loud in the sudden quiet. I'll pay 10. Every head in the square swiveled toward him. He could feel their stares, a physical weight of surprise and suspicion. Across the square, leaning against a post outside his office, Sheriff Blackwood straightened. The scar on his cheek twitched. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face as he watched the scene unfold. This was a test. Thorn knew it. 15, a rancher from the crowd, shouted, egged on by his friends. 20, Thorn set his voice flat, his eyes locked on the woman who had spoken. The rancher hesitated, then laughed. Let him have him. He'll have his hands full with that one. Sold, the auctioneer declared, slamming a gavel against the platform. To Thorn Mason for $20. As Thorn stepped forward, counting out the silver dollars, a significant portion of his meager funds, he felt Blackwood's eyes on him, cold and appraising. He signed the ledger, the scratching of the pen unnaturally loud, and accepted the bill of sale. He moved to the platform and, ignoring the auctioneer, used his own knife to saw through the ropes binding the women's wrists. They rubbed their raw skin, exchanging glances that spoke a language of shared endurance he couldn't comprehend. The woman who had spoken Maya met his gaze. Why she asked the single word encompassing a universe of questions. Not here, Thorn said quietly. My farm is a half-day's ride. You'll be safe there. She searched his face, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent, looking for the trap, the lie. Finding none, or perhaps simply seeing no better option, she gave a single curt nod to the others. As they stepped down from the platform, moving toward his wagon, Blackwood pushed himself off the post and blocked their path. Making some interesting purchases, Mason. The sheriff drawled, his voice dripping with false congeniality. He spat a stream of tobacco juice on the ground near their feet. You always did have a soft spot for the natives. Thorn's hand instinctively went to his side, a phantom ache from an old wound. They needed help, Sheriff. That used to mean something in this country. Times change. Blackwood said, his smile never reaching his eyes. You made a mistake yesterday, Mason. Getting involved. Today you just doubled down on it. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. Some debts can't be paid with silver. I'll be collecting what you owe me, Monroe. Sooner than you think. He stepped aside, a mocking bow. Thorn ushered the women past him toward the wagon. He didn't look back, but he could feel Blackwood's stare burning into his back like a brand. He had come to town seeking answers and had instead thrown down a gauntlet. He had spent $20 not just on 3 lives, but on a declaration of war. A war he wasn't sure he could survive, let alone win. The ride back to the farm was a silent, tense affair. The sun beat down, turning the air into a furnace. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft, rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on the parched earth. Wee Helona and Maya sat in the back, their faces stoic, their bodies swaying with the wagon's movement. They spoke to each other in low, quiet Apache, their words a secret language that created an invisible wall around them. Thorn left them to their privacy. He was a stranger, their buyer, and for all they knew, a captor no better than the men in town. Trust was a currency he did not possess. He could only hope to earn it. When they arrived, the farm looked even smaller and more desolate than usual under the harsh afternoon light. The small cabin with its weathered porch, the barn in need of new siding, the struggling fields, it was a portrait of endurance, not prosperity. As he pulled the wagon to a stop, the cabin door flew open. Luke stood framed in the doorway, his rifle held at the ready. His eyes widened when he saw the 3 women in the back of the wagon, and his face hardened into a mask of suspicion and hostility. Pa, he called out, his voice tight. What is this? Help for the farm, Thorne said, simply climbing down from the seat. The lie felt flimsy, even as he said it. Put the gun down, Luke. They're guests. Guests. Luke lowered the rifle, but didn't put it down. His eyes narrowed with a prejudice learned from 1,000 frontier whispers scanned the three women. They're Apache. The word was an accusation. After what they did to the Wilkins family last spring. That wasn't these women. Thorne said, his voice sharp with a sudden anger. And I will not have that kind of talk in this house. They will be treated with respect. Do you understand me? Luke's jaw clenched, a mirror of Thorne's own stubbornness. A flash of defiance crossed his face, but he held his tongue, turning to stomp back inside the house. Grace appeared in the doorway behind him, her small face filled not with fear, but with a wide-eyed, solemn curiosity. Thorne turned to the women. You can sleep in the main room by the hearth, he said, gesturing inside. You are not prisoners here. You are free to leave whenever you wish. But I give you my word, you will be safe on this land. Maya translated for the others. Wee responded with a burst of what sounded like angry questions, her glare fixed on Thorne. Helona remained silent, her gaze drifting toward Grace. Wee asks why we should trust the word of a white man, Maya said, her tone neutral. It was a fair question. Thorne had no good answer. I can't give you a reason, he said honestly. Only time will show you my intent is true. He paused, then added, Blackwood will be coming. The sheriff from town. He believes I am his enemy. By helping you, I have made you his enemies too. We are safer together than apart. This Maya seemed to understand. She spoke to Wee again, her tone placating but firm. The tall woman's hostile posture eased slightly, replaced by a wary vigilance. As they moved into the spare but clean cabin, Helona's eyes fell upon the charcoal drawings scattered on the table. Grace, seeing her interest, shyly approached and held up her latest sketch of Catherine. Helona took the drawing with a surprising delicacy. Her long, slender fingers traced the lines of the face, and for the first time since Thorne had seen her, a flicker of emotion other than grief crossed her features. She spoke, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. Helona was an artist in our village. Maya explained, a hint of warmth in her voice. She painted stories on hides. She says the child has a strong spirit in her hands. Grace, who rarely responded to anyone, beamed at the praise, a rare and brilliant smile that lit up her small face. A fragile bridge was being built, a connection forged in the shared language of art and loss. Later that evening, long after the children were asleep in the loft, Blackwood arrived. He didn't come with deputies or a posse, just a single rider materializing out of the dusk like a bad omen. He sat on his horse in the yard, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. Evening, Mason, he called out. Or should I say Monroe? Thorne stepped onto the porch, his own rifle in his hand. You're on my land, Blackwood. Just a neighborly visit, the sheriff said, his voice smooth as poison. Wanted to make sure your property was settling in. His eyes scanned the cabin. You know, it's a funny thing. I was looking through some old Army records today. Captain Thomas Monroe, decorated war hero until he wasn't, disappeared after a skirmish at Apache Pass. Some say he deserted. Some say he turned traitor. Some say a lot of things, Thorne said, his voice a low growl, most of them lies. Are they? Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You and I know what really happened that day. And I know what you took from that pass. Something that didn't belong to you. Thorne's mind flashed to the locket. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, Blackwood said, his voice hardening. You have something of mine, Monroe. Something I need back. A certain document. Proof. You return it, and your new friend's here. He gestured to the cabin might just live to see another sunrise. You don't? Well, this is a dangerous country. Accidents happen. He wasn't talking about the locket. He was talking about something else entirely. A document proof. It made no sense. There was no document. You have until sundown tomorrow, Blackwood said, wheeling his horse around. Give me what's mine, or I'll come back and take it. And I'll burn everything you care about to the ground while I do. He spurred his horse into the darkness, leaving Thorn alone on the porch, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. The pieces were starting to shift, forming a picture he didn't understand. Blackwood wasn't just driven by a 15-year-old grudge. He was afraid. Afraid of something Thorn supposedly possessed. A secret buried at Apache Pass, a secret the sheriff was willing to kill for. And now Thorn and his entire family, both old and new, were standing right in its path. The next day passed in a haze of tense preparation. An unspoken truce had settled over the farm. Luke, though still sullen, worked alongside his father, his earlier animosity replaced by a grim understanding that they faced a common enemy. He reinforced the barn door and checked their meager supply of ammunition, his movements efficient and focused. Inside the cabin, a quiet domesticity took hold. Wee, her initial hostility softened into watchful acceptance, proved to have a surprising skill for gardening. Her strong hands tending the struggling vegetables with a gentle expertise. Helena and Grace spent hours together at the table, a silent communion of charcoal and paper passing between them. Maya moved through it all like a connecting thread, her quiet competence, a calming influence. She and Thorn worked together to board the windows, their hands occasionally brushing their movements, falling into an easy rhythm. In the silences between the hammer blows, they talked. Blackwood was your lieutenant, she stated, not a question. Thorn nodded, not surprised by her perception. He was ambitious, cruel. He saw the Apache not as people, but as an obstacle. An obstacle to what Maya asked, her eyes sharp. I never knew, Thorn admitted. I thought it was just hate. But now, he spoke of a document, proof of something. He thinks I have it. And do you? No. Thorn shook his head. The only thing I remember from that day besides the killing is a locket, belonging to a dead soldier. He described the eagle in flight. Maya's hands stilled. I remember, she said softly. The young soldier who died trying to help a child. His name was Miller. Thorn stared at her. You were there. You saw it. I saw everything, she said, her voice dropping. I saw Blackwood cut you down. I followed his men when they carried your body away, thinking you were dead. When they left you in a shallow grave, I pulled you out. I took you to a cave and tended your wounds. The fragmented memories in Thorn's mind suddenly coalesced. A cool hand on his feverish brow. The soft sound of a healing song sung in a language he didn't understand. A pair of dark, determined eyes watching over him. It was you, he breathed. You saved my life. You tried to save mine first, she replied simply. A debt was owed. Before Thorn could process the revelation, Luke appeared in the doorway. Pa. Someone's coming. It was too early for Blackwood. A lone rider approached, kicking up a cloud of dust. As the figure drew closer, Thorn's heart lurched. The rider was a woman sitting her horse with a familiar, elegant grace he hadn't seen in 15 years. She rode into the yard and dismounted, her face pale and strained, but her eyes, the same deep blue he remembered, were fixed on him. Thomas, she said, her voice a ghost from another life. Thorn's own voice was a rough whisper. Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth, Blackwood Daniels' younger sister. the woman he had been engaged to marry, the woman he had left behind without a word. Luke stared, his mouth agape, as Maya stepped onto the porch, her expression unreadable. The two women in Thorne's life, past and present, stood just feet apart, the air crackling with unspoken history. "You have to leave," Elizabeth said, her voice urgent. "Now. Daniel knows I've come. He's not just coming for the women. He's coming to silence you for good." She took a shaky breath. "It was never about a grudge, Thomas. It's about the silver." "Silver?" Thorne asked, confused. "The land at Apache Pass." Elizabeth explained the words, tumbling out in a rush. "It belongs to the Apache, but it sits on one of the richest silver deposits in the territory. Daniel made a secret deal with a railroad baron years ago. The massacre wasn't a military action. It was a land grab. He was clearing the way for the mines." Her eyes were pleading. "He thinks you have the original survey map, the one proving the conspiracy. He believes it was in a letter from our fort commander. He spent 15 years convinced you've been holding it, waiting to expose him." The pieces crashed into place. The brutality, Blackwood's obsession, the dead robber with the locket. He must have been one of Blackwood's men sent to find the non-existent proof. The locket itself was just a coincidence, a cruel trick of fate. "There is no letter," Thorne said. "There never was." He won't believe that, Elizabeth said, her face ashen. "He's raised a posse. Drunk, angry men from the saloon. He told them you're a traitor leading an Apache uprising. They're coming to burn you out. They'll be here within the hour." The world narrowed to the immediate, terrifying reality. They were out of time. "The cave," Maya said, her voice calm and steady amidst the rising panic. "Helona knows a place in the hills. We can hide there." "We can't all go together," Thorne said, his military training taking over. "They'll follow our tracks. We have to split up, create a diversion." He looked from Maya to Elizabeth, a desperate plan forming. "Maya, take the children, and Helona. Use the hidden trails. Luke, you go with Wee-Wee. Take the high ridge. Move fast." "What about you?" Luke demanded. "I'll stay with Elizabeth," Thorne said. "We'll lead them on a chase, give you all time to get away." He saw the doubt in Maya's eyes, the flash of jealousy, but there was no time to explain. Elizabeth knew her brother's mind better than anyone. She was their best chance. As they scattered to gather what little they could carry, Elizabeth touched his arm. "Thomas, I'm sorry. For all of it." "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said grimly. "You just gave us a fighting chance." He looked out at the hills, at the family he had cobbled together from the broken pieces of his life. He was no longer just Thorne Mason, the grieving farmer. He was Captain Thomas Monroe, again a commander with lives depending on him. He would not fail them this time. The escape was a desperate, breathless scramble. Maya led her small group with quiet efficiency, her movements sure and silent through the scrub and rock. Grace held tight to Helona's hand, her small face set with a determination that mirrored her father's. In the cave, a small dry shelter, hidden behind a curtain of wild grapevines, and they waited. Luke and Wee-Wee arrived minutes later, having seen the dust cloud of the posse from the ridge. Then nothing. Hours crept by. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red. Luke paced the mouth of the cave, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "They should be here," he said for the 10th time. "Something's wrong." Just as darkness began to settle, a figure appeared stumbling up the rocky path. It was Thorne alone, his face smeared with dirt, his shirt torn. Pa Luke rushed to him. "Where's Elizabeth?" Thorne sank to the ground, exhausted. "She led them south," he said, his voice ragged. "Drew the whole posse away. She saved us." He looked at Maya, his eyes filled with a weary grief. She told me. She's sick. Dying. This was her way of making things right. A heavy silence fell over the small group. They were safe for now, but at a terrible cost. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few scraps of food. Their home was likely a pile of smoldering ash. Blackwood was still out there, his rage now surely stoked to a fever pitch by Elizabeth's betrayal. They spent a cold, miserable night in the cave. The next morning, huddled together against the chill, they debated their next move. Fleeing seemed the only option. But where? As the sun rose higher, a new figure appeared on the trail below. It was Pastor Thomas, the town minister, leading a mule. He saw them and raised a hand in peace. "Mr. Mason," he called out, "I was hoping I'd find you here." Thorne stepped out wary. "What do you want, Pastor?" "I saw the smoke from your farm last night," the pastor said, his face grave. "I know what Blackwood is, what he's capable of. I've held my tongue for too long." He looked Thorne directly in the eye. "I was there, Captain Monroe, at Apache Pass. I was Corporal Peterson. I saw what you did. I saw you try to stop it." Thorne stared dumbfounded. The pastor he'd seen 100 times in town, a quiet, unassuming man, was a witness. A witness who had finally found his courage. "The territorial marshal is in Willow Springs," the pastor said. "He arrived this morning. He's investigating reports of corruption. If we go now, if we tell him what we know, we might finally see justice done." It was a terrifying gamble, to walk back into the lion's den. But as Thorne looked at his son's determined face, at Maya's steady gaze, at the two small girls who depended on him, he knew it was the only choice. Running was over. It was time to fight back with the only weapon they had left, the truth. The confrontation took place in the dusty main street of Willow Springs, in front of the sheriff's office. The territorial marshal, a tall, no-nonsense man named Harrington, stood on the porch flanked by Blackwood, whose face was a thunderous mask of rage. The entire town had gathered a silent, watchful audience. Thorne, with Pastor Thomas at his side, told his story. He spoke of the massacre, of Blackwood's greed, of the 15 years he had spent in hiding. Maya spoke next, her voice clear and strong, corroborating every word. Her dignity and intelligence were undeniable, chipping away at the crowd's ingrained prejudices. Then Pastor Thomas gave his testimony, the words of a soldier, finally unburdening his conscience. He described the horror of that day, the cold-blooded murder of women and children, and Captain Monroe's desperate, solitary attempt to uphold his honor. The crowd murmured, their loyalties visibly shifting. Marshal Harrington listened to it all, his expression grim. "Sheriff Blackwood," he said, his voice like iron, "you are under arrest for conspiracy murder and abuse of your office." Blackwood, cornered and exposed, finally snapped. His eyes were wild, the eyes of a trapped animal. With a guttural roar, he lunged not for a weapon, but for the closest, most vulnerable target. He grabbed Grace, who had been standing near the porch, and clamped a hand over her mouth, pulling her back into the sheriff's office and slamming the door. "Everybody stay back," he shrieked from inside, "or the girl dies first." The crowd gasped. Thorne's world narrowed to the closed door, his daughter's life hanging by the thread of a madman's sanity. "Hold your fire," Marshal Harrington commanded his deputies. "He wants a negotiation." "I'll talk to him," Thorne said, stepping forward. He was no longer Thorne Mason Farmer. He was Captain Monroe Tactician. He handed his rifle to Luke. "Cover the back window. Don't shoot unless you have a clear shot and she is safe." He approached the office, his hands raised. "Blackwood, let her go. This is between you and me." It always has been. Monroe, came the muffled reply. You ruined everything. All I want is what you took, the map. The map. Elizabeth's words echoed in his head. He's convinced you have the survey map. And then another memory clicked into place. The locket. Private Miller, the soldier who had died at Apache Pass, had been on the survey team before enlisting. Could it be? I have it, Blackwood, Thorne yelled, gambling everything on a desperate hunch. The proof you've been looking for. It's not a letter. It's in a locket. The locket from the dead robber. He turned to the marshal. The evidence from the robbery. There was a silver locket. I need it. A deputy retrieved the small evidence bag. Thorne took the locket, his fingers fumbling with the tiny clasp. It sprang open. Inside, behind a faded portrait of a young woman, was a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of Apache Pass, with a specific section circled and marked with a symbol for silver. This is it, Blackwood, he shouted, holding it up. I'll trade you the map for my daughter. The door creaked open a few inches. Blackwood's crazed eyes peered out. Slide it over. No tricks. Thorne placed the locket and map on the wooden porch and slid it slowly toward the door. As Blackwood's hand snaked out to grab it, Thorne moved. He dove low and fast, crashing through the door, a human battering ram. He slammed into Blackwood, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The sheriff's gun went off the shot, burying itself in the ceiling. Grace screamed and scrambled away into a corner. Thorne rained punches down on Blackwood, 15 years of rage and grief fueling his fists. He was a soldier again, fighting for survival, fighting for his family. He disarmed the sheriff and hauled him to his feet, pinning him against the wall just as the marshal and his deputies burst in. The standoff was over. In the aftermath, as a subdued Blackwood was led away in chains, Thorne knelt and pulled Grace into his arms, holding her as she sobbed. Over her head, he saw Maya standing in the doorway, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He had faced his past and won. He was free. The falling action was a quiet coda to the storm. Thorne, or rather Thomas Monroe, gave his official statement to Marshal Harrington. His military record was cleared, his name restored. But when the marshal asked what he wanted to be called, he didn't hesitate. My name is Thorne Mason, he said. Captain Monroe is a ghost. The marshal, a man who understood the burdens of the past, simply nodded. He made official arrangements granting Maya Wee and Helona protected status and title to the small plot of land Thorne's farm stood on, ensuring their safety and their home. Blackwood's railroad conspiracy unraveled, and the silver at Apache Pass was placed under federal protection, its fate to be determined by treaties, not greed. A few days later, Elizabeth prepared to leave town. She was heading east, she said, to see the ocean one last time. She found Thorne by the creek, watching Grace skip stones across the water. He deserved his fate, Thomas, she said quietly. But he was still my brother. I mourn the man he could have been. I know, Thorne said. Thank you, Elizabeth, for everything. Live well, she said, her voice soft. You've earned your peace. She touched his cheek gently, a final fond farewell, and then mounted her horse and rode away, a solitary figure, disappearing into the vastness of the West, her conscience finally clear. The final scene took place a week later, back at the farm. The cabin, though scorched around the edges, had survived. The community, shamed by their complicity and inspired by the quiet courage they had witnessed, had helped with the repairs. It felt like a new beginning. Inside, Thorne found a small, hand-carved box that had belonged to Catherine. He had not opened it in 10 years. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, was her simple gold wedding ring. He picked it up, the metal warm against his skin, a tangible link to the love that had first anchored him to this life. He remembered her smile, her unwavering belief in their future. He had failed to give her that future, but he had protected the children she had given him. After a moment of quiet reflection, he closed the box. He didn't hide it away in a drawer. Instead, he placed it on the mantelpiece, a place of honor. It was part of his story, part of who he was. He was no longer running from his ghosts. He was learning to live alongside them. He turned. Luke stood in the doorway, no longer a resentful boy, but a young man, his father's pride shining in his eyes. Wee Wee and Helona were in the garden, their laughter carrying on the breeze. And Maya was on the porch watching him, a soft, understanding smile on her face. He walked to her, taking her hand in his. Together they looked out at the land, their land. It was no longer a refuge from his past, but a foundation for their future. Grace ran up to them, her face glowing. In her hands she held a new drawing. It wasn't of her mother or a horse or a sad woman. It was a picture of all of them, Thorn, Luke, Maya, Wee Wee, Helona, and herself standing together in front of the small cabin, the sun shining brightly overhead. She looked up at her father, her eyes clear and full of a light he hadn't seen in years. "We're home, Papa," she said, her voice a complete, perfect sentence. "We are all home."